It was just after sunrise when the backhoe bit into the hillside and hit metal. The operator killed the engine, and in the stillness that followed the desert seemed to hold its breath. I remember walking up dust rising off my boots and seeing the faint edge of a rusted steel door buried beneath 70 years of rock and roots. Someone had carved a symbol across it. Not letters, not numbers, just a spiral etched by hand weathered smooth as bone. That's when the air shifted. Even after all these years, I can still feel it, that sense that something beneath our feet had finally exhaled. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from, and tap subscribe if you think every buried truth deserves daylight. Back in the summer of '92, Dry Creek Junction was the kind of place you only noticed when you needed gas between Phoenix and Tucson. One stoplight. A grocery that still weighed produce on a hanging scale. And at the heart of it all, the Desert Star Diner, a squat, silver-trimmed box with a flickering neon sign that never quite went dark. I was 45 then, running night patrol for the Highway Division. My beat stretched 32 miles of two-lane road, where coyotes crossed more often than cars. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, when the static on the radio got too thick and the coffee from my thermos had gone cold, I'd pull into the diner. That's where I met Claire. She always worked the late shift, said she liked the quiet hours. I remember her moving through the narrow aisles, balancing coffee cups on a tray with the kind of steadiness you can't fake. She'd pour me a refill without asking and say, "You look like you've been chasing ghosts again, George." I'd grin till her ghosts didn't drive Fords, and she'd laugh, a soft laugh, low and quick, like she was careful not to disturb the dark outside. She was young, but carried herself like someone older, the kind who'd learned early how to read a room. Folks around town liked her. Her parents lived just a few miles north, a small ranch house behind a wind-tilted fence. Darlene kept her garden neat as a quilt pattern. Hank still tinkered with his old Ford pickup, though his lungs were giving him trouble. They were good people. Proud private, the kind that waved from the porch but didn't gossip much. The nights in Dry Creek had their own rhythm. You could hear the hum of the highway a half-mile away, see the glow of the diner sign from the ridge road like a beacon. The air smelled of creosote and dust after sundown, and by midnight, the desert cooled fast, one of those small mercies the locals counted on. Sometimes after I finished my route, I'd park near the diner and just listen to the desert settle. Claire would step out back for a smoke before closing apron still tied her hair caught up with a pencil. We'd talk about nothing important. Her plans to take a few college courses in Tucson, how her dad was saving up to fix the roof, or how the jukebox had eaten someone's quarters again. It was a simple time, or at least it felt that way. We didn't know how quickly the world could tilt. That August, the monsoon season came late. The days hit 110, and the air had that heavy stillness that makes dogs restless. The horizon shimmered like a mirage, and the road dust clung to everything. Your windshield, your skin, your thoughts. I remember one night, a Friday, when the diner's neon kept cutting out. Claire joked that the sign was haunted. The hum of the fluorescent lights flickered then died, leaving her face lit only by the glow of the pie case. She looked out the window like she was listening to something far off. Then she said quietly, "Sometimes it feels like the desert's holding its breath." I didn't think much of it then. I told her it was just the heat, the kind that plays tricks on your head. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Deputy Mike Anders came by that same night, young, eager, still wearing that new badge shine. He teased Claire about serving burnt coffee and told me he'd been checking a report of strange lights near the old service road. I brushed it off. Out here, folks saw what they wanted to see when the night stretched too long. But later, when I drove that stretch myself, I caught a glimpse of something odd, a dim glow tucked deep in the mesquite, steady and low like a lantern someone forgot to snuff out. I slowed, thought about checking it, but dispatch called in a breakdown near mile marker 22, and I moved on. By the time I circled back, the glow was gone. The next day, Claire mentioned she'd heard footsteps behind the diner after closing. Said she thought it was just wind rattling the trash lids, but the way she said it, soft, uncertain, stuck with me. I told her to keep the back door locked, maybe ask Mike to swing by at closing for a few nights. She nodded, thanked me, and went back to wiping the counter, humming under her breath. Dry Creek didn't get much trouble, not the kind that sticks. A bar fight once in a while, a rattlesnake in somebody's garage, and out-of-towner speeding through the flats. But that August had a strange edge to it. Radios crackled more than usual, dogs barked at nothing, and even the old-timers stopped sitting out on their porches after dark. Still, life went on. I'd see Claire every few nights, same stool, same smile. Sometimes her mother dropped by with a container of peach cobbler. Sometimes her father waited outside in his pickup to drive her home. Everything looked the same from the outside, but every so often I'd catch her glancing toward the highway, eyes fixed on the stretch that led east into the desert. One evening, near the end of the month, she asked me if I'd ever been out past the old gravel pit beyond mile marker 24. I told her it was restricted. The county sealed it years back after a flood washed part of it out. She nodded almost to herself and said, "Funny, I thought I saw someone walking up there last night." I asked who, but she just shook her head. Didn't recognize him. Looked like he knew where he was going. After that, she went quiet. Wiped down the counter, refilled my coffee, and changed the jukebox record to Patsy Cline. I figured she was tired, maybe just spooked from working nights alone. That was the last easy conversation we ever had. A week later, I noticed her old Corolla parked out behind the diner long after closing. The windows were fogged from the heat, a jacket draped across the seat, but no Claire. The kitchen light still glowed. The neon sign buzzed weakly against the dark, and the night air felt heavier than usual, thick waiting. I knocked on the door, but the sound just vanished into the stillness. Somewhere out in the desert, thunder rolled without lightning. I told myself she was probably fine, maybe in the back room. Maybe her father had come to pick her up, but something about that half-lit diner stayed wrong in my gut. I sat there a while longer, engine idling, headlights sweeping over the empty lot. By midnight, the only thing moving was the paper napkin caught in the wind, scraping softly across the asphalt. The next night, the diner was dark, and the phone, the one she always answered on the second ring, never rang again. I sat in my truck that night longer than I should have, watching the diner lights fade one by one until only the neon open sign buzzed faintly against the window. I told myself not to worry, that Claire probably got a ride home with her folks, that maybe the power flicker had her closing up early. But the truth is, I'd been around too many years to ignore that tug in my gut when something didn't sit right. The next morning, the air already felt different still, but heavy like before a storm. The heat hadn't broken, and the highway shimmered in waves of pale gold. When I drove past the diner around 9, the lot was empty except for her Corolla still parked in the same spot, dust settling over the windshield like time itself had stopped sometime during the night. The door was locked, blinds down. I stepped out, checked the handle, warm to the touch. I remember my reflection in the glass looking older than I had the night before. I called dispatch and asked if Claire's family had reported her missing. Nothing. I left a message at the Matthews place just to check in, then drove out toward their house off County Road 11. The desert was quiet in that way it gets when even the birds don't want to move. Darlene answered the door, apron still on her face, pale and creased. She said Claire hadn't come home after her shift. Hank had already driven the back roads twice, checking pullouts and gas stations. I offered to help. He didn't say anything at first, just turned, grabbed his keys, and walked straight past me to his truck. That was Hank, the kind of man who believed answers came from doing, not talking. We searched for hours, starting near the diner, then working out toward the old gravel pit and the service road beyond. The sun hit 108 by mid-afternoon, and the air rippled with heat. When we passed Deputy Anders near the junction, he pulled over and stepped out, sweat darkening the shoulders of his uniform. He'd already heard from dispatch and was setting up a bolo across the county line. He promised to send word to the troopers along the interstate. I remember him looking toward the mountains, shading his eyes, and saying, "It's like she vanished right off the map." By dusk, we'd checked every turnout between the diner and her parents' place. No tire tracks, no sign of struggle, no dropped keys or purse, just the hum of crickets and the long shadows of saguaros stretching across the road. Darlene waited at home, the porch light on, though it was still daylight. When we came back empty-handed, she just stood there on the steps, hands clasped in front of her like she was praying without words. That night I drove back to the diner again. Something about the place wouldn't let go of me. I parked near the edge of the lot, left the engine running for the air, and walked the perimeter with my flashlight. The door locks looked untouched. Around back, the desert pressed right up against the building, a slope of sand and scrub that led into a stand of mesquite. I saw faint scuff marks near the rear steps, maybe from boots, maybe from wind. It was impossible to tell. I swung the beam across the trash bins, the propane tanks, the narrow stretch where the gravel met sand. Then something glinted, a small metal circle half buried near the fence line. I brushed away the dirt and held it to the light. It was a cigarette lighter, silver, engraved with a spiral, not the kind you'd buy at the gas station. This one looked old, hand-carved, maybe worn smooth at the edges. The next morning I brought it to Anders. He turned it over in his hand, said it didn't look like anything Claire would have owned. We logged it, tagged it, and that was that for the moment. The sheriff's office started a full search by noon. Volunteers from all over the county came out, ranchers, truckers, retirees with metal detectors and canteens. Helicopters flew grids over the desert, and by the second day the news had reached Tucson. Folks stopped for coffee at the diner just to talk about it. Some swore they'd seen her car moving near mile marker 26 that night. Others claimed a stranger had been hanging around the diner earlier in the week, tall, quiet, wearing an old army jacket. Rumors bloom fast in a small town, and by the third day every shadow had a name. But nothing stuck. No witnesses, no evidence, no clear timeline. Just a bright, kind girl gone without a trace. Her parents barely spoke. Hank sat on the porch most evenings, staring out toward the hills. Darlene kept baking pies, bread, casseroles, anything to keep her hands moving. A week later, I drove out to the edge of the gravel pit, the place Claire had asked me about. The county had posted a faded sign years earlier, warning of unstable ground. The fence was half collapsed, and the soil had that reddish tint that always reminded me of dried blood. I parked near the gate, stepped out, and let the heat close around me. There was no breeze, no sound but the ticking of the engine as it cooled. A few yards in, I found tire impressions narrow like from a motorcycle, not a car. They led partway down the slope, then disappeared where the sand thickened. When I walked closer, I caught the faintest smell of oil or maybe something older metal and dust baked together by years of sun. I followed the ridge until I reached a hollow shaded by a cluster of mesquite. That's where I saw it, a patch of ground that looked too smooth, too deliberate. I knelt, brushed it with my hand, and felt the edge of stone. A circle maybe 2 feet wide, carved with markings that didn't make sense. They looked almost like letters, but not in any alphabet I knew. I marked the spot and called Anders. He came out that evening with a camera and evidence tape. We photographed it, measured it, logged the coordinates. He said it might have been an old survey marker or part of some mining claim, but when he tried to lift the stone, it wouldn't budge. Beneath it, the sand felt packed, not natural. He promised to get a team from the county geological office to take a look. But a day later, the call came back, funding delay, short staff, low priority. Just another odd rock in the desert. For a while, life tried to return to normal, though nothing really did. The diner reopened under new management. Folks stopped mentioning Claire's name in public, but you could feel her absence like a missing tooth in a smile. Every time I drove that stretch of highway, I caught myself glancing toward the gravel pit, half expecting to see her Corolla there, windows catching the light. 2 months later, I got a letter. No return address. Just my name typed on the front and a postmark from Flagstaff. Inside was a single photo, black and white, grainy, maybe from an old camera. It showed what looked like a clearing in the woods, a stone door half covered in roots and carved into its surface that same spiral I'd found on the lighter. No note, no explanation, nothing. I drove straight to the sheriff's office. Anders looked at it, whistled low, and said it had to be some prank. But when he turned the photo over, there was a smudge of dirt along the edge, fine and reddish, the same color as the soil from that pit. We sent the photo to the state lab. Weeks passed. No match, no traceable source. It was as if someone had dropped it out of time. That fall, when the first cold winds swept down from the mountains, I went back to the diner one last time. The new owner had cleaned up the place, replaced the neon sign, repainted the walls. But in the back storage room behind a loose panel, they found a small notebook wrapped in wax paper. The pages were water-stained and nearly unreadable, but the name scrawled on the inside cover stopped me cold. W. Kruger, 1945. None of it made sense. The writing inside jumped between German Latin and what looked like symbols. I kept thinking about the stories my grandfather used to tell, rumors about German officers who'd slipped across the Atlantic after the war, hiding out in the desert, chasing strange relics buried under old mining claims. I never believed them. Until now. Anders filed the notebook into evidence, but within a week it was gone. The clerk swore she never logged it. The record sheet had been torn from the binder. It was the same with the lighter, the same with the photo. 3 pieces of something we couldn't name, all erased as quietly as they'd appeared. By the end of that year, the search had gone cold. Claire's parents sold their house and moved north. The county closed the case for lack of evidence. But every so often, when I drove night runs for the towing company, I'd take the long way home through Dry Creek. Some habits never leave you. I'd pass the diner dark and still and watch the neon reflection fade across my windshield. Out past the ridge, the gravel pit sat under a thin white moon, silent as a grave. And every once in a while, only on the hottest nights when the air hung so still you could hear your own heartbeat, I'd catch a flicker of light out there just beyond the fence line. A pale, steady glow like a lantern half buried in sand. I'd tell myself it was headlights from the highway or a reflection off the rocks. But deep down, I knew better. Something out there was waiting to be found, and the desert patient, as it is, never forgets. I didn't see the light again after that fall, at least not for a while. Winter came early that year, sharp winds pushing down from the mountains, filling the desert with dust. Dry Creek went quiet. Most of the volunteers had drifted back to their lives. The sheriff's office turned its attention to new calls, and the search for Claire faded to the edges of local memory. But for me, it never stopped. I'd spent too many nights on those roads not to know when a story wasn't finished. And every time I thought about that stone buried near the gravel pit or the lighter with the carved spiral, I could feel that old restlessness stir in my chest. In February, about 6 months after she disappeared, a call came through from the county storage lot. The officer on duty said someone had broken into the evidence trailer. At first, they thought it was kids after the radios or ammo boxes, but when they took inventory, they realized the only things missing were tied to Claire's case, the lighter, the photograph, and that notebook we'd found behind the diner wall. Nothing else was touched. No prints, no tire tracks, no sign of forced entry. Just the empty shelves and a door left swinging open in the wind. When I told Hank and Darlene, Hank didn't say a word. He just sat in his chair, staring past me. Darlene reached for my hand, her fingers cold and trembling. She said something I'll never forget. "If she's gone, I can live with that. But I can't live not knowing." It was the kind of truth that leaves you with nowhere to go but forward. So I did what I'd always done. I started driving. Over the next few months, I combed the old records myself, digging through logs, maps, and forgotten reports. What I found didn't make sense. A string of references to a man named Wilhelm Kruger, same name that was scribbled inside the notebook. Turns out he'd been a German colonel who vanished at the end of the war. The official story said he disappeared somewhere near the Black Forest in 1945. No body, no confirmation, just gone. But a handful of declassified files from the 90s linked him to something called Operation Yulan. No details, only a note that the operation's assets might have been moved through Arizona territory under post-war transit. That line stopped me cold. It didn't make sense at first how a missing officer from Europe could have anything to do with a waitress in Dry Creek 50 years later. But the timing, the strange symbols, even the language in those files, it all felt too close to ignore. I brought what I found to Anders, but he wasn't the same young deputy I remembered. The investigation had worn him down. He'd started smoking again, and the light in his eyes had gone flat. He flipped through the papers, sighed, and said, "George, whatever this is, it's above our pay grade." I told him pay grade didn't mean much when someone you knew vanished into thin air. That spring, I drove up to Flagstaff to visit an old friend from my patrol days, a historian named Rachel Moore, who'd spent her retirement cataloging World War II relics for the State Museum. I showed her the photo of the stone door and the notes from the Kruger file. She looked at the spiral engraving, traced it with her fingertip, and said softly, "I've seen this before." She went to her bookshelf and pulled down a thick binder filled with photos from an excavation in Europe, artifacts taken from abandoned Nazi bunkers. There it was again, that same spiral carved into a piece of metal recovered from a site in Bavaria. Rachel said the symbol wasn't military, it predated the war entirely. It showed up in old Nordic and Celtic relics often associated with burial chambers or what she called transition sites. When I asked what that meant, she hesitated. Places where people believed the world blurred, she said, between life and death, past and present. I asked if anyone had traced Kruger beyond 1945. She shook her head. "No one credible," she said. There were rumors he escaped through Spain, others that he died underground, but some believed he brought something back, something he shouldn't have. Driving home that night, I couldn't shake her words. The road through the desert was empty, the stars sharp against the black sky. Every few miles I caught the flicker of headlights in my rearview mirror, but they never drew close. When I finally turned down the road toward Dry Creek, the lights were gone. A week later, a hiker passing through the hills near the old gravel pit reported a sinkhole about 20 feet wide. Said he almost fell in when the ground gave way beneath him. The county marked it off, but no one had the resources to check deeper. I went out there alone the next evening. The wind had picked up, carrying the smell of rain. The hole was maybe 6 feet deep at the edge, widening as it went down into shadow. I tossed in a stone and waited. It hit something metal before rolling into silence. When I leaned closer, I caught a draft of air rising from below, cold, still too even to be natural. The next morning I called Anders again, told him what I'd found. He sounded tired, said he'd send a team when they could. That night I dreamed of the spiral. It kept turning slowly like something alive. 2 days later, the sinkhole caved completely during a storm. The earth folded in on itself, revealing what looked like the edge of a tunnel framed in concrete. When the rain stopped, I drove out before dawn. The mud was slick, the sky pale with first light. I climbed down as far as I dared and saw it, a door half buried, rusted but intact with the same carved symbol across its surface. My flashlight beam caught the faint outline of a handle still bolted to the frame. I called it in, and within hours the place was crawling with people. County officials, deputies, a couple of men in plain clothes who didn't introduce themselves. They sealed the area and told me to leave. I watched from the ridge as they pried the door open and lowered themselves into the dark. By sunset, they'd brought up several crates covered in tarps, loaded them onto unmarked trucks, and drove away without a word. When I asked Anders what they'd found, he said he didn't know, and for once, I believed him. The next day, the site was fenced off. By the weekend, the fence was gone, replaced with a patch of fresh dirt and a posted notice citing soil stabilization. It was like it had never happened. Only a week later, I got another letter. Same typewriter font, no return address. Inside was a single line. Not all maps lead out. That phrase hit me like a blow. I'd read it before in Kruger's notebook, scribbled in the margins beside sketches of strange landscapes. I took the letter to Rachel. She looked at it under her lamp, studying the ink. "This isn't a copy," she said. "It's the same hand. Whoever wrote this, they knew him." She paused, then added quietly, "Or they are him." I didn't know what to make of that. Kruger would have been over 100 by then, if he was even alive. Still, when I left her house, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following me. Every time I turned down a new road, a black sedan appeared a few cars behind, never close enough to see the driver. When I stopped for gas near Payson, it passed slow-tinted windows glinting in the sunlight, and then it was gone. Back home, I sat at my kitchen table staring at that letter until the words seemed to pulse. I thought about Claire again. Her laugh, her easy calm, the way she'd glance out toward the highway like she could hear something the rest of us couldn't. I wondered if she'd found this same place before it opened up. Maybe she'd seen something she wasn't supposed to see. Maybe that's why she never came home. I spent that summer collecting what little I had left, copies of the photo, the symbol, the letters, the coordinates from the gravel pit. It wasn't much, but it was proof something had happened here. Something big enough for people to hide. I filed a report with the state, but no one called me back. The diner changed owners again, and the Matthews' old house sat empty, dust gathering on the windowsills. One night in late August, I was closing up the tow yard when I noticed a small package wedged under the office door. No label, no note, just wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a tin box, old and rusted. When I pried it open, I found a journal, leather-bound pages yellowed with age. On the first page, in careful handwriting, was a name, W. Kruger, April 1945. I didn't move for a long time. Outside, the night hummed with cicadas, and the air felt heavy again like the desert was holding its breath. I opened the journal and began to read. The first entry was dated the week Germany surrendered. The last was August 12, 1945, the same date the files listed as his disappearance. That was the moment I realized Claire's case had never been a small-town mystery. It was part of something that had started long before either of us were born, buried deep beneath the sand and silence of the desert. I read until sunrise, the words growing stranger, the handwriting rougher, like a man unraveling. He wrote of watchers in the forest of maps that burned in dreams of a door that opened both ways. The final line made my hands go cold. They will come for me when silence returns. I looked out across the yard. The sun had just cleared the ridge, washing everything in a pale, brittle light. Somewhere out in that desert under 70 years of dust, the truth was waiting. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to find it, and it would change everything I thought I knew about what happened to Clare Matthews. The morning after I finished reading that journal, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted around me. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was that quiet, heavy certainty that comes when you realize you've been walking beside the truth for a long time without seeing it. I sat at my kitchen table, sunlight cutting through the blinds, pages spread out in front of me, and I knew I wasn't just looking at the scribblings of a mad soldier. What Kruger had written, those notes about watchers, about doors, about guilt, it all carried the weight of a man trying to confess without anyone left to hear him. His words didn't feel like rants. They felt like warnings. That afternoon, I took the journal to Rachel. She spent hours reading it in silence, her glasses slipping down her nose as she turned the fragile pages. When she finally spoke, her voice was low. "These aren't the words of a Nazi loyalist," she said. "This man was hiding from something, but not from justice, from history itself." She showed me a list of names in the back, most of them crossed out, a few marked with strange symbols. When we compared them to the old OSS files she had access to, the pieces started to align. They weren't German officers. They were people who had disappeared during the war. Scholars, medics, even a few Jewish families listed as missing but never confirmed dead. There beside one of the symbols was a note in English helped them escape. I remember leaning back letting that sink in. If it was true, Kruger hadn't been running from capture, he'd been protecting those he helped. Maybe even smuggling them out through his so-called operation. But then came the darker question, what had he been hiding with them? And why did it still matter? 80 years later. We decided to show the journal to a contact of Rachel's, a historian who'd spent years working with declassified intelligence archives. His name was Owen Grant, a quiet man with the kind of patience only librarians and field agents seem to have. We met him in a diner 2 towns over, a booth tucked away near the back. He listened while Rachel explained the discovery eyes never leaving the notebook. When she finished, he said one word, Franconia. I asked what that meant, and he told us it was a forest region in Germany, south of the old American occupation line. He said there were reports never confirmed of underground sites there, hidden bunkers built late in the war for continuity operations, meaning secret relocation of personnel and materials. Some of those materials, he added, had supposedly been shipped overseas under false manifests after 1945. Owen leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. If Kruger made it out, he might have built a mirror of that hideout here. He looked at me, then eyes steady. And if he did, it's probably still under your desert. Those words sat heavy on me the whole drive home. The wind had picked up by the time I reached Dry Creek, kicking dust across the highway. That night I couldn't sleep, so I took my truck out past the old pit parked where the sinkhole had been filled. I sat there with the engine off, staring at the pale stretch of sand, trying to imagine what might still be buried beneath it. The desert was quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your chest. Then, just as I reached for the ignition, I heard a faint sound like metal shifting deep underground. It came once, then again, then stopped. I told myself it was settling earth. But something about it didn't feel right. 2 days later, Anders called. He sounded shaken. The county had received an anonymous tip, a map drawn on yellowed paper mailed to the sheriff's office. It showed a network of tunnels branching under the hills marked with unfamiliar coordinates and a single word at the bottom echo. Anders thought it might be a prank until he noticed the handwriting. It matched the letters I'd received. He told me not to get involved, but by then it was already too late. We met that evening near the ridge under a sky bruised purple with dusk. The air smelled of rain and copper. Anders had brought a metal detector and a field light. We followed the map's grid through the brush until the detector clicked near a flat patch of ground. It wasn't much to see, just stones half covered by moss and dust, but when we cleared it, there was a hatch. Steel weathered, stamped with the same spiral I'd seen on the lighter. My pulse kicked hard in my ears. Anders called it in, and by morning the area was crawling with state and federal teams. They kept us back at first, but one of the supervisors, recognizing my name from the old case files, let me stay close. They pried the hatch open and lowered a camera drone. The footage came back grainy, full of static, but what little we saw stopped everyone cold. The chamber below was nearly intact. Rusted bunks crates stacked against the wallpapers still scattered across a desk that hadn't been touched in decades. And there, on the concrete wall painted in black that hadn't faded, was that twisted compass symbol again, the one Rachel had described from the Bavarian artifact photos. When they went down in person, the air that came out was cold dry, untouched. They found ration tins, broken tools, even books, some military manuals, others handwritten in a mix of languages. The deeper they went, the stranger it became. Shelves lined with notebooks covered in mirrored writing pages of diagrams overlaying human anatomy with constellations. It didn't look like any military installation I'd ever seen. It looked like someone's sanctuary or their prison. At the center of the room was a table. On it sat a sealed tin box nearly identical to the one that had been left at my door. Inside was another journal, the same handwriting, the same signature, W. Kruger. But this one didn't end in 1945. The last entry was dated 1957. I watched as they read it under the floodlights. The writing grew erratic words mixing between German and Latin, then symbols again. One line repeated over and over, "The forest keeps what it takes." That phrase crawled under my skin. The analysts whispered among themselves, some saying it was madness, others calling it code. But when they translated parts of it, the entries described voices outside the bunker, footsteps that left no prints, a knocking on the walls at night. He wrote that he'd buried the truth for those who will inherit the silence. What chilled me most wasn't what they found, it was what they didn't. There were smaller rooms branching off the main chamber. Inside were shoes, clothing utensils, even toys. None of it could have belonged to Kruger alone. And yet there were no records, no bones, no other names. Whoever had been there with him, if anyone had, they'd vanished long before we ever arrived. By evening, they'd sealed the tunnel and ordered the site classified. The trucks left before dawn carrying crates marked for archival transport. When I asked where the supervisor said Washington, but his tone told me I'd never find out more. Anders quit the force not long after. Said he couldn't keep chasing ghosts. Rachel, though she kept working quietly, cross-referencing the new materials with Kruger's earlier notes. She told me she'd found evidence suggesting he might have been coordinating an escape route that stretched from Europe to the American Southwest, moving people and artifacts through decommissioned supply lines. She said he may have come here not to hide treasure, but to bury something worse, the truth about what the Reich had done, or maybe what it had found. Weeks later, another rumor began to spread online. A satellite technician claimed they'd detected a series of heat signatures beneath that same stretch of desert patterns that looked too structured to be geological. The county dismissed it, said the equipment was faulty. But when I went out there one last time, the ground still felt warm under my boots, even after sunset. That night, I stood alone beside the old gravel pit, wind cutting low through the brush. In the distance, thunder rolled over the mountains, and for a moment I thought I heard it again, that faint metallic sound rising from beneath the earth, steady and deliberate like someone knocking from below. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Somewhere out there between the cracks of history and the silence of this desert, a man had tried to bury what he couldn't explain. Maybe he'd succeeded. Maybe not. Either way, I had the feeling we'd only just scratched the surface. For weeks after they sealed the site, I couldn't drive past that stretch of desert without feeling the weight of it pressing through the soil. The crews left, the fencing came down, and the county covered the entrance with fill dirt, but you could still see where the land had sunk just slightly, like it remembered. I knew better than to ask what they'd taken from that bunker. Every agency involved had gone silent. Reports disappeared, files went missing, and the men who'd been there that day were reassigned. Even Anders, who'd always been honest to a fault, stopped returning calls. When I finally caught him in town a few months later, he looked 10 years older. He told me he'd signed something, and that was all he could say. But his eyes said the rest, whatever they'd found down there, it wasn't just history. I spent that winter mostly alone, going through everything I had left, the letters, the photos, my own notes. I kept thinking of Claire, the way she used to stand outside the diner with her hands tucked into her apron pockets, watching the road like she was waiting for something only she could see. I wondered what she might have stumbled across that night, and whether she'd been searching for the same answers we were. It's a strange thing the way memory works. You spend years chasing facts, and in the end, it's the faces you can't forget. Not the reports, not the evidence, just the people who were there before it all broke open. When the state historian's office finally issued a statement, it didn't mention Kruger or the bunker by name. It talked about a Wubbo-Wutu-era underground structure of limited historical significance. They said the materials had been transferred for archival review, that there was no evidence of human remains. That was it. No mention of the journals, the symbols, the small shoes found in the adjoining rooms. It was as if those details had been wiped clean, same as Claire's case all those years ago. I should have felt angry, but what I felt was tired. Some truths don't get erased because they're too dangerous. They get erased because they ask questions no one wants answered. Rachel retired not long after. She told me she couldn't look at another classified file. Before she left, she gave me a copy of one of the journal pages, the one with the phrase, "The forest keeps what it takes." She'd translated a few lines beneath it. Roughly, it read, "To remember is to keep the dead from wandering." She said she thought Kruger had written it as a kind of prayer, not for himself, but for the people he couldn't save. I still have that page framed in my office right above the old police scanner I never use anymore. Sometimes I catch myself staring at it when the nights get too quiet. As for the Matthews family, they never came back to Dry Creek. Their house sold to an out-of-town buyer, and the diner shut down again a few years later. Locals still remember Claire, though they don't say her name often. Around here, when a story ends without answers, folks tend to fold it into silence like a letter they're not ready to read. But once in a while, someone will mention her, usually at the coffee shop, usually around midnight, and you'll see it in their faces. That small hesitation before they speak, like they're not sure if they're remembering a person or a ghost. In the spring of 2025, the site made the news again. A retired ranger, one of the men who'd first mapped the pit, was hiking near the same ridge when his drone picked up an anomaly. He said it looked like a second chamber, smaller, deeper, maybe connected to the original tunnel. Within a week, the area was under investigation again. Only this time, they didn't announce anything. No press release, no crews, no trucks. Just a handful of unmarked SUVs parked off the service road for a few days, and then nothing. When I drove by later that month, I saw new tire tracks cutting through the sand, leading to a mound that hadn't been there before. Someone had been digging. Someone had also covered their work very carefully. I told myself to leave it alone. But curiosity is a stubborn thing. It doesn't fade just because the years do. So one evening I parked near the ridge and walked down with a flashlight. The air was still, the kind of still that makes your heartbeat sound louder than it should. I didn't find much, just a few pieces of rusted metal half buried in the soil. But when I shone the light at the rocks near the wash, I saw it again. Faint, almost gone, scratched into the stone that spiral. Older now, worn by wind and sand, but unmistakable. It looked like someone had carved it there, not as a warning, but as a reminder. I don't pretend to understand what Kruger believed or what he thought he was protecting. Maybe he'd lost his mind in that bunker. Maybe he was telling the truth in the only language he had left. What I do know is this: he wasn't the monster the records made him out to be. He was a man haunted by what he'd seen and by the weight of what he couldn't undo. In a way, I think he and Claire were both looking for the same thing, a way to bring a little light into a world that had buried too much in the dark. And for both of them, it cost everything. A few months ago, I got a letter. No return address, just my name typed neatly across the front, same as before. Inside was a single photograph, black and white, taken from what looked like inside the bunker. In the corner of the frame, a faint silhouette of a woman, her back to the camera, facing a painted compass on the wall. I can't prove it was her, but the shape of the hair, the tilt of the shoulders, it looked like Claire. Underneath, in handwriting I didn't recognize, was one line. The silence returns. I showed it to Rachel, now living in Oregon. She said it was probably a hoax, but her voice didn't sound certain. She asked what I was going to do with it, and I told her nothing. Sometimes leaving a story alone is the only way to let it rest. It's been 33 years since that summer in Dry Creek. The roads are quieter now, the diner long gone, replaced by a rest stop that smells of diesel and rain. But on certain nights when the wind shifts, I still think I can hear the faint hum of that old neon sign and the clatter of dishes through the open window. I see Claire's smile, her tired eyes, the way she'd pour coffee with one hand while turning the radio dial with the other. Those are the things I hold on to. Not the mystery, not the fear, but the small, ordinary moments that existed before all of this began. People sometimes ask me why I still talk about her. why I can't let it go after all these years. I tell them it's not about closure. It's about remembrance. The truth doesn't always come wrapped in justice, and not every grave gets a marker. But as long as someone remembers the sound of a voice or the way light hit a face just before it vanished, the story isn't lost. When I stand out there now on the edge of the desert at sunset, the air cools fast and the horizon burns red, like the earth is still holding on to the day's last breath. I think about all the names that never made it into the reports, all the lives folded quietly into history. Maybe that's what Kruger meant when he wrote, "Not all maps lead out." Maybe some lead us back to the things we buried, to the people we couldn't save, to the truths we're still learning how to face. I don't know if the forest he wrote about was real or if he meant something bigger. All I know is that silence has a way of keeping its promises, and the desert patient, as it is, remembers everything. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, not for clicks, but so no one's name, not Claire's, not any of theirs, gets lost to the dark.